Right, a huge welcome for the first time to author John Heyman with The Falsification of History and what was the real truth behind the sinking of RMS Titanic in 1912. Taking us back 100 years to the famous Titanic disaster, which hit an iceberg and sank, right? Well, maybe it did. John covers inconsistencies with the official tale. Dear me, not that one again. Famous names in the finance world: Rothschilds, Rockefeller, JP Morgan, and possibly a business venture that didn't work out, culminating in the loss of Morgan's no-claims bonus, possibly paid for with innocent lives. And an official story that stubbornly sticks to the unfortunate accident theory, case closed. But how well does it stand up to independent scrutiny? Let's find out. Please welcome John Heyman.
Thanks very much, everyone, and welcome to the real story about the sinking of the Titanic. Just first of all, can everyone hear me at the back? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Right, what I'm going to tell you tonight is quite a complex little tale, or quite a complex large tale. So what I've tried to do, I put together a PowerPoint presentation that hopefully tries to simplify it. You must bear in mind that there are two or even three strands running concurrently through the whole story. And of necessity, I do tend to skip from one to the other and back again. And I try to make it make sense, but please bear with me if there's bits that you don't follow, because like I said, it is quite complex, but it does all come together at the end. So hopefully bear with me. And the other thing to bear in mind is that I'm not a professional speaker. I'm a writer and author, so if you're all expecting Ian R. Crane, then you might as well get your money back now. I'll do my best. Okay, so off we go. We all know what that ship is, and we've had it sussed as almost from being this high. This story has been part of our folklore for as long as anybody can remember in living memory. So we all know what that ship is, or do we? That's actually not the Titanic. It's identical twin sister, the Olympic. So what do we know about what happened on that night of 14th, 15th of April 1912? Not an awful lot, really. Although we hear so much about it, everyone thinks that they know the story. Well, trust me, you don't. And this is what we're coming to now. We know for sure that a very large ship sank in the early hours of the 15th of April. And we know that there were more than 1,500 lives lost, and that 700 survivors were rescued by another ship, the Carpathia. But once he said that, he said everything. Everything else is really up for question, seriously. And I'm going to show you how that is the case. So let's start by having a fresh look at some of the facts. Moving swiftly onwards. Yeah, so to come up with the story that I've come up with, obviously it wasn't all my work, but there's a lot of my own research gone into this, and a lot of the stuff in there is stuff that is unique to me. So where did I get it from? Well, this is where I got my information from. I looked at the transcripts of both inquiries. There were two inquiries about the Titanic disaster. One was the American inquiry, one was the British. Looked at both of those. I looked at Howland and Wolff public records. Howland and Wolff was the shipyard that built the ships. Okay, various other sources, libraries, internet, blah, blah, blah. And the one thing that really struck me about it all was that there were so many unanswered questions and anomalies with the official story that made me just think that, hang on a minute, let's have a closer look at this. So what does the official story consist of? It's basically all those things. Can we all read that at the back? Is it large enough? Yeah, okay. So at the risk of just standing here and reading the slides, it's basically all propaganda from the White Star Line. Dozens and dozens of eyewitness accounts, hardly any of which agree with each other. Contemporary newspaper reports, which I'm sure some of you are aware of this phenomenon. Whenever there's a disaster that's not as it appears, the first reports that come out you never see them again, a lot of them, because they change the official story as time goes on, and some of the reports contradict the new official story, so you never get that. So by looking back at old newspaper reports, I've actually found a lot of stuff that's never mentioned and absolutely conflicts with the official story. Okay? So the inquiries were generally regarded as a whitewash. Okay? And the conclusions that they came to were so obviously incorrect as to be mind-blowing. There was also a British and US government cover-up, which again, as we go on, I'll talk more about that. And one of the things that has been responsible for the apocryphal tale about the Titanic, one of the major things that's been responsible for it, is a book, which some of you may have read, and a film, which some of you may have seen, and it was this one. I'll just click on it. It's called A Night to Remember, and it was written by a guy called Walter Lord. And Walter Lord, just for a bit of background on him, he was an ex-CIA agent. Now, the first thing that interested me was what on earth is an ex-CIA agent doing writing a story about a shipping disaster 40 years previously. And the conclusion that I came to on that was for the same reason that the CIA get involved in anything and everything, and that is to cover it up and obscure the truth. So the Titanic myth that we all know and love so well is a result of that book and that film. And trust me, 80% of it is utter hogwash. Right, so let's just set the scene a little bit. We have to turn back the clock a little way, first of all. A guy by the name of J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan, who was a big American financier at the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th into the 20th century. Very close links to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and all the usual suspects. Okay, he bought the British White Star Line, which was the line that eventually built the Titanic and the Olympic and the Britannic, the three sister ships. Okay, the British government, because it was a foreigner, they had to sanction the purchase. And they imposed certain conditions on that purchase, on that sale, which, please bear that point in mind, because that will become very important a little bit later on. Okay, there's Mr. Morgan himself. What a nice man. Okay, so in 1907, Morgan asked Harland and Wolff Shipyard, who almost exclusively built ships for the White Star Line, by the way, to build a new class of luxury liners, and he was going to call that the Olympic class. And work started, as it says there, in 1907 at Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast. And it was going to be three ships. Firstly, the Olympic, closely followed by the Titanic and the Britannic, which came a little bit later. And these were going to be the largest moving objects that had ever been built at that time. Olympic and Titanic would be virtually identical, but significantly there were some differences, and again we'll come on to that a little bit later as the story develops. Okay, so in 1910, this is where we swap over onto another little thread, which you're going to have to bear in mind as well as we go through it. In 1910, what appears at first sight to be a totally unrelated incident, 7 extremely high-powered American financiers met in total secret at a place called Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia in the USA. Okay? They were the representatives of those powerful financial organisations, J.P. Morgan himself, and as I said before, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. Okay? It was all done in absolute secrecy, and this is documented, and the documentation is available, so this is not my speculation. No surnames were used at all. And their plan was to introduce something into the American economy called the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, I guess most people have heard of the Federal Reserve Bank. Is there anyone who doesn't know and wants me to explain what the Federal Reserve Bank is? Don't be shy. Okay. We all know what the Federal Reserve Bank is. But just in case someone's too shy to put their hands up, I'll just give you a brief picture of what the Federal Reserve Bank is. Think of it as the American version of the Bank of England. Okay, so it's the American central bank that has the responsibility for the issuance and creation of money. Okay, now, the reason for the secrecy was that there was some powerful opposition to this plan. Okay, we've covered that. Why was the Federal Reserve Bank so important? It was one of the next step in their plans for world domination, basically. They needed the Federal Reserve Bank to just backtrack, say, 20 years before 1910 to about 1890. The decision had already been taken. Now, this might sound fantastic to some of you, but others may know that this is the case. In 1890, World War I was already in the planning, but there was no way of financing it because it would have taken absolute massive amounts of money, huge amounts of money. And the only way that they could do that was to come up with a way of creating money. And the way that they decided to do that was by introducing the Federal Reserve Bank, which was basically going to usurp from the American government the ability to create and introduce money into the economy. So it was so important because World War I was a big part of their plans for the 20th century, and that's why it was brought in. But as I say, there were powerful interests opposing the Federal Reserve Bank, not from any benevolence of the masses, of the ordinary people, but only because it would seriously diminish their own fortunes. And this guy was one of them, Benjamin Guggenheim, you may recognise the name. Another guy was John Jacob Astor, and Isidor Straus. Now, neither of these were three of the richest men in the world, but none of them derived their own fortunes from finance. It was industry, retail, leisure, but not finance, and that's very important. I'll just give you a moment to read that. I won't read it out myself, but that's an important statement from Henry Ford that Henry Ford made in 1918. And he was talking about the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay. And a little bit more recently, a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Fulford, who some of you may have heard of, came out with that statement, which is what we're talking about tonight, basically. Part of what we're talking about tonight. Okay, so why were these powerful guys opposed to the Federal Reserve? Because, as I said, they knew that the Federal Reserve would undermine their own personal fortunes because they weren't going to be involved in it, basically. So it wasn't through any benevolence that they were opposing it. It was purely selfish reasons. So let's get that up front straight away. The reason that it would impact on their own personal fortunes was because when you introduce a way of creating money into the system that is not done by the government and it's done by private interests, every note that comes into circulation, and this is true of our country today even, has a portion of interest attached to it, which is owed to the bankers, right? So the Bank of England produces money, and it's not the government that asks the Bank of England to do it. The Bank of England does it as a private corporation, and the government has to pay interest to the Bank of England, believe it or not. And that is the reason for the national debt, nothing else. So any other BS that the government comes out with for the national debt is nonsense. I'll tell you right up front, right now, it's because of the way the Bank of England operates. So, and that causes extreme inflation. We all know that throughout our lifetimes how much prices have gone up, how much wages have gone up, maybe not in the same proportion, but things just constantly go up. And the reason for that is not the rubbish that we're told by the media and the government, it's because the interest has to be paid to the bankers, and that's the only reason for inflation. Okay, so extreme inflation will be very dangerous to these guys who oppose the Federal Reserve, and it could even have destroyed their fortunes, so that's why they're opposed to it. Indeed, after the Titanic incident, just so happened that Mr. Morgan himself acquired their businesses anyway. So, just something to bear in mind. Okay. Morgan was also the largest shareholder in IMM, which is International Mercantile Marine, which were owners of the Californian. And for those of you who know the Titanic story, the Californian was the ship that got blamed, or the captain of the ship that got blamed for the Titanic disaster. Okay, so Morgan was involved in that too. And the reason for that will become apparent as well. Okay, and IMM also owned the Lusitania, which, as it rightly says, that's another story for another time, but believe me, that isn't all it seemed as well. Okay, let's just look at the general situation surrounding Atlantic crossings in the 19th century. After all, the 1912 and 19th century had only finished 12 years previously. But it was mainly immigrants going to America. And basically, the ship owners didn't care. They were just worthless lives, these people, just poor people. So they overloaded the ships, they overinsured the ships, insurance scams were absolutely rife. They didn't care. Okay, and it was also an industry that was noted for fraudulent practices. So, moving on apace. The first of the ships off the production line was the Olympic, which was, for all intents and purposes, identical to Titanic, and that was launched early 1911 and had its maiden voyage on the 14th of June that same year. Now, Olympic was not immune to little disasters itself. It had quite a few, shall we say, mishaps. On its maiden voyage, it almost sunk an American tug. Okay, but the biggie, as far as Olympic was concerned, was that in September of that same year, as it was leaving Southampton Harbour, steaming down Southampton water to head out into the Channel, it was involved in a horrendous accident with a Royal Naval cruiser called HMS Hawke. Now, that was never publicised, alright, it is available information, I'm not saying you couldn't find it out, but how many people knew that? Put your hands up that actually happened. Okay, about 6 people, fine. Okay, so, yeah, very important point. Now, the damage to Olympic was far more serious than they first thought. It limped back into Southampton Harbour for initial testing. There's HMS Hawke. That was almost a write-off as well. But Olympic went back to Southampton and they did the initial damage assessment and they found a huge hole. And by a huge hole, I mean a huge hole. You'll see a picture of it in a minute. But even worse than that, there was all sorts of unseen damage as well. There were bent and broken beams, metal beams. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of rivets that popped. Steel plates were completely ripped away. It was a mess. It was a mess. There we are. And that was the main bit of the damage, but it stretched. It had an impact down almost 1/3 of the ship. Now, the biggest problem that it had was it had twisted the keel of the Olympic, and this was causing a huge list of port. It was quite dramatic, actually, for list of port, and again, that becomes important in a little while.